Hi everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to start a series of lectures that deal with the various branches of government. So we've talked in broad terms so far in previous lectures about Congress, the judiciary, the executive branch. We've mentioned maybe the bureaucracy in passing. The next set of lectures is going to be looking at these various parts of government in a lot greater detail. What we're going to start with right now is the Congress, which corresponds to book chapter 10. And of course, Congress is the institution that's in charge of legislation or lawmaking in our government. So today we're going to be going over, first of all, an outline of how Congress is structured, which is, of course, important if we want to get into these important details about how it works and what it does. So we'll start with just some broad discussion of its structure, move on then to talk about individual members in Congress and sort of how they try to make their decisions, what's motivating them. We'll go on then to talk about some of committees and other resources that are available to help people in Congress and the body more broadly accomplish all the things that it needs to do. Just basically how labor is divided within the Senate and the House in order to make sure everything is done and finished. Next, we're going to get into a few topics on how laws are created. First of all, the general lawmaking process, which applies to most of the legislation that goes through Congress. Then, to conclude, we'll talk about a really special case of lawmaking, the appropriations process, which is the process that Congress goes through every year to spend money. To start, like I said, let's just talk a little bit about the basic structure of Congress, how it's arranged. We'll get into these various aspects that are listed here on this slide in a bit, but this is just a convenient replication of them here. So Congress, as we've said before, is bicameral, meaning that there are two different chambers within it. Unicameral would be a legislative body which has only one chamber, but we have two chambers, the Senate and the House. A lot of the duties and responsibilities and functions of these two chambers are similar. However, there are a few key differences that are worth noting. First of all, the House is a lot bigger than the Senate, so the House has 435 members. The Senate has only 100. In terms of who members of the House represent, you're also talking usually a more confined geographic domain. So in the House, each member represents one specific district, each district having about 600,000 people within it. Senators represent an entire state, on the other hand. This has the effect of generally having a representative in the House have a closer relationship with his or her home district, as opposed to a senator who usually is dealing with, again, a lot larger of a geographic area. Another trait distinguishing the House from the Senate is that bills dealing with the raising of revenue, in other words, taxation, have to originate in the House. And the reasoning for this goes back to what we were talking about in an earlier lecture on the Constitution. Think back how we were talking about how maybe the greatest impetus behind our split from Great Britain is this idea of taxation without representation. So the British government was taxing the colonies. Those that were being taxed didn't feel like it was just because they didn't have adequate representation in Parliament. So the reason that the House is tasked with the creation of taxation bills is that it's more directly responsive to the people than the Senate is. So, first of all, back as the Constitution is originally ratified, the Senate isn't even elected directly by the people. So the House is actually the only body in the federal government selected directly by the people. Point here being, the people have more influence over the House than any other branch of government, so any taxation, if it has to be started in the House, the people are going to have more of a say on it than they otherwise might if the Senate were allowed, for example, to propose new taxation. As it turns out now, the Senate is also elected by popular vote, so this is less of a concern, but still, this practice is observed that any new taxation has to be originated in the House. Now, when the Senate eventually gets their hands on it, they can offer amendments to it to change it to their liking, but still, the bill has to actually technically start in the House. Getting into another process that has kind of a split between the House and the Senate. In terms of impeachment, if you've ever heard this term before, you probably have. This is the procedure that's available to the legislative branch to remove officials from the executive branch if they are suspected of really abusing their job, committing high crimes or misdemeanors is the standard that they use. This process initiates, in the House. So whenever someone is suspected of doing something that rises to this standard, the House can pass articles of impeachment. This is basically serve as an indictment, if you want an equivalent to how criminal procedures work in the real world, outside of government. You have to be indicted first, and then you get a trial. The House basically is in charge of indictment in the impeachment process. We talked about how House members serve districts, which are usually smaller geographic areas, compared to senators, which serve the entire state. This is illustrated on this map. This is obviously the state of New York. If you're a senator from New York, you're serving this entire state here, upstate, the city, and then where we are in Long Island. If you're a representative, on the other hand, you're only serving a subset of the people. So your district is going to be confined, and usually you've got about 600,000 people in each district. One thing that you'll notice is that as you get upstate, the districts become larger. The geographic extent of them is larger, and this is, obvious why, right? The density of the population is a lot larger down here. The people are more compact. Higher population density basically means smaller congressional districts. So the area where 600,000 people are living is a lot smaller in New York City than it is at other places in upstate New York. Moving on to the Senate. Like I said, this was originally a chamber that wasn't selected directly by the people. So the framers of the Constitution intended it more to be a body where the members would have some freedom of action, to where they wouldn't be directly responsive to the will of the people. The House was meant to be that one chamber where the people have their say. The Senate was meant to be, in some respects, a check on the House, who may act unwisely sometimes as a result of following what the people want. In terms of exclusive powers, the Senate has two that are really important. One is the ratification of treaties. So whenever the president goes, and we'll talk about how the president affects foreign policy in a following lecture, the president or his representative negotiates a treaty with another nation. It then has to go and be voted on by the Senate for approval. This requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate, actually, so it's a pretty high threshold to ratify treaties, and the House has no say on whether or not a treaty is ratified. It's only the Senate. The second exclusive power that you want to be aware of in the Senate deals with presidential appointments. So all of the stations in the executive branch, most of them are appointed by the president directly, so he gets to select who fills them. However, a lot of the more important ones, such as cabinet posts, for instance, the heads of the major departments in government, the president selects them, but then the Senate has a say as well. They have to give their consent to each nominee. Judges and Supreme Court nominees is another example. Here, the appointment only requires a simple majority in the Senate for approval. However, we'll talk about filibustering in short order here in the lecture. This is one way that in the past, the Senate, if they didn't like the president's nominees, the minority in the Senate could still hold them up. However, this power in recent years has been curtailed pretty greatly. Now it only applies to the Supreme Court nominees when they arise. So overall, if you're in a situation like we are, the upcoming presidency, where one party is going to have control of both the presidency and the Senate, the president will have a pretty easy time of getting their appointments passed through. Finally, getting back to impeachment, we talked about how the House has exclusive power to bring basically indictments, articles of impeachment. When that occurs, the Senate is the chamber that basically holds a trial. So there's going to be evidence presented during this phase. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over it to bring the hearings to order and control them. After all the testimony and evidence is presented and deliberated on, the Senate then has to vote to determine whether to convict and remove the president from office. This is, again, though, something that requires a supermajority of 2/3 of the Senate, so you would need 67 senators to vote in favor of removal, and again, a very high threshold. If you think back, the last president, one of only two to be impeached by the House, Bill Clinton. During that period, there's a roughly 50-50 split between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, and the voting broke down almost exclusively on party lines. So where the Republicans voted to remove Clinton, the Democrats all voted not to remove him, and because there's basically a 50-50 split, it obviously didn't obtain that 2/3 threshold needed for removal. Alright, so now that we've gone over, in broad terms, how Congress is structured, let's now talk about how do individual members of Congress act? What's driving them? Well, the one thing that all members of Congress have now, the shared goal is re-election. Some might say that this statement is cynical in nature, but it's just the truth. When you're in Congress, unless you're one of the handful of people that's retiring at the end of term, you've got to constantly think of how things and how actions impact your chances of being reelected. It's just how politicians are. So compared to other parts of the government, the presidency is the other part of the federal government that is elected through popular elections, indirectly through the Electoral College, but people do vote on the president. Comparatively, members of Congress, first of all, they have a more narrow path to re-election. They only have to be responsive to a particular district or a particular state, as opposed to the president, who has to win the popular vote in enough states, throughout the country, in order to win a majority in the Electoral College. So there's that difference. Also, members of Congress aren't limited in terms of how many terms they can serve. So the presidents only get 2 terms of 4 years. Members of Congress are allowed to run for office however many times they want. So they can be in the House for however many times they win re-election. Same with the Senate. So there's a bit more of a long-term consideration there as far as your reputation goes. The president at some point in his career no longer has to worry about re-election, but for members of Congress, until you reach your retirement, that's always on your mind. Okay, in terms of re-election, again, I'm not making normative judgments about whether this is a good thing or bad thing that it's such a big priority for those in Congress. I'm just stating that most people would agree it is. In terms of re-election, the fact that you're in Congress to begin with, the status of being an incumbent affords you a pretty big advantage. So incumbents are re-elected at a rate of about 90%. However, you're constantly doing whatever you can to avoid being in that 10% you lose. So you want to make sure that you're faithfully serving your constituents, not garnering a whole lot of disfavor to the extent that your incumbency advantage is overwhelmed, and you have to fight for your life to stay in Congress once re-election comes by. One way, besides overall just broadly serving in a way that the people in your district or state like, another way to try to secure re-election and to gain favor among your constituents is through casework. This would be a more narrowly focused set of actions that people in Congress can take, and interacting with specific individuals within their district or state. So if you've got someone in your district who's having problems with collecting their Social Security check or becoming eligible for some other program, or there's somebody in your district who's a contractor that is having trouble getting paid by some agency in government, What they can do is get in contact with their congressman or congresswoman, and this person can direct their staff to get in touch with whatever executive agency is at play here, and use their influence to get this situation resolved in favor of whoever is petitioning, talking to the congressman or woman's office. So at this point, when that happens, you're helping not only the person that's asking for assistance. This has the effect of garnering a positive reputation throughout your district, even with others that aren't served. You have social circles, and people are going to be talking to others, their friends, their family, about what Congressman so-and-so did for them. Sometimes these actions will be on the news if they're noteworthy enough. So this is a good way to garner a good long-term reputation to help with the re-election task for people in Congress. Continuing on the topic of representation, what does this mean? So I've used the term faithfully serving your constituents earlier in the last few slides. So what is actually meant by this? It kind of differs between the House and the Senate depending on which chamber you're talking about. Specifically, most political scientists would tell you that House members tend to be more responsive to the people as a function of the way their terms are structured than senators, who tend to have longer terms. So when we talk about representation in the framework of the delegate model, this is what most members in the House will be doing. This basically means responding to the wishes of your people directly. So whatever sort of policies they want passed, if there are particular policies that they don't want passed, behaving and voting in Congress in a manner that's consistent with this. So in this case, less thinking for yourself and more trying to get a sense of what the sentiment is in your district. And the reason that this characterizes the House is, like I just said, just because of the term structure. If you're in the House, you're being reelected or up for reelection every 2 years. Ideally, you're being reelected every 2 years. But in order to be reelected, you have to be responsive to the people, just because they're the ones with an eye on you. They're the ones who, if you have a major vote or a series of votes that they don't like, re-election is always right around the corner for you in the House. So you have to constantly have that in mind. The other major model of representation is called the trustee model, and this is more accurately a characterization of those in the Senate. So recall that senators serve terms that last 6 years, as opposed to the House, where they're reelected every 2 years. So the trustee model is implying that those who go on in the Senate and go into Washington, D.C., they're not there just to merely regurgitate what the people in their district want. They're there to be a trustee for them. When a piece of policy comes across the Senate and they're trying to determine whether or not to vote in favor of it, they should go out, not necessarily just see what their district wants, but get the relevant information, consult experts, do their own thinking on it, whether it would be a good thing or a bad thing, both for the country and the state they represent, and then ultimately vote in a way that reflects this deep thinking on the matter, rather than just seeing what the people in your state like and just voting mindlessly in that manner. And again, the term structure of the Senate allows this to happen. In the House of Representatives, you have to be a lot more responsive to the people. Just if you want to stay in office, you can't afford to really be going against their will too frequently, because 2 years, every 2 years, again, you basically face a vote of approval or not, where you could be removed from office. In the Senate, if you make a vote that people don't like, in the first or second year of your term, you've still got several years to make up for it. And over the long term, you can do things to raise your reputation and favorability in your home state that can make up for one or two unfavorable votes. So being in the Senate gives you more leeway to be a trustee rather than just a simple delegate. Okay, let's get into a bit of a different topic now. Moving away from individual representatives, let's now discuss, in broader terms, how the body of Congress works. Within the House, within the Senate, they've got a lot of different responsibilities. How do they all get discharged in an orderly manner? The key here is basically how labor is divided within Congress, and the primary mechanism of dividing labor between the 100 senators and the 435 representatives is through committees. Okay, and so the committee structure basically separates everyone in either the Senate or the House into smaller groups, and they're overseeing more distinct areas. So they'll have a few specific areas of policy that they have to be responsive to and become relative experts on, but they don't have to they don't have to consider every single thing that's being considered at one time in Congress. The work effort is spread out across them to make it easier to get everything done, basically. Okay. So when we're talking about the committee system, most of the work is going on in standing committees. So standing committees are committees that are permanent in nature, and they're formed as a response to policy areas that are both important and persistent. So if you've got an area of policy like the armed services, we're always going to need an effective defense force, to protect us from foreign threats. So in response to that, we form a committee, a standing committee that's permanently there in both the Senate and the House has its own version, where people are going to be in there, gain expertise about the armed services, what types of policy we should pass, and they'll be there to oversee the legislation concerning the armed services indefinitely. Same thing for things like commerce and foreign affairs. These are areas of policy that basically aren't going away. We need a permanent place in Congress to consider the various policies in these domains that may or may not improve the economy, relations with foreign governments, things like this. And so what goes on in standing committees? We'll talk about this a little bit more in detail when we get into the lawmaking process here in a bit. This is where things like drafting bills, having hearings on bills, the work that goes on behind the scenes before you even get into the bill being considered on the main floor of the Senate or the House. Most of the work is going on in these standing committees. Here you'll see just a list of each of the committees in the Senate and the House. You'll notice that there are more in the House. Some of them are procedural in nature. We'll talk about one, the Rules Committee, specifically in a bit. But in large part, the policy domains overlap, right? So agriculture, this is an important, persistent area of policy. Both houses have a corresponding standing committee on agriculture. Energy, obviously important. Homeland security, and in recent years, this has been deemed important enough to warrant its own committee. You don't have to remember the specific, all these specific committees. Just note, that most of them are in response to a really broad, important, persistent area of policy that needs to be addressed. So in the Senate, there are less senators, as we've mentioned numerous times at this point, than in the House. We have 100 people being spread across all these different committees, so senators generally serve in more committees than their counterparts in the House, usually about 5, where someone in the House serves on 2. Typically, when you join a committee, you're not bouncing around to different ones every year or every term. Usually, the purpose of assigning someone to a committee is that this person is interested in this area of policy. Maybe their state or district has particular interest in this area, and so they're likely to go there and take the time over the years and sometimes decades to become an expert in this area. So you usually don't want someone bouncing around every couple years and completely changing the composition of the committees. Some of them are competitive as well, like in the House, for instance. The Rules Committee, which we'll talk about in a second, is very difficult to get on. The Ways and Means Committee, dealing with taxation. Some of them are more desirable than other committees. A lot of the times in the Senate, those senators who might have presidential ambitions, sometimes they try to get on like the Foreign Relations Committee, the Armed Services Committee, committees that could give them like relevant foreign policy experience, so that when they are running, they have this to point to. So sometimes it is competitive as to who gets on committees and who doesn't. Oftentimes it's determined by seniority, and you have to serve a certain number of years in either the House or Senate before you're really given serious consideration to go on one of the more competitive committees. All right, so beyond standing committees, which are permanent, as we said, another type of committee known as the Select Committee is there as an option to form if there's a more transient area of policy that needs looked at. And these type of committees would form to look at one specific maybe piece of legislation or investigate one particular event, and then they dissolve after their work is done. Examples of this, for example, the 9/11 Commission, formed after 9/11 to investigate the attacks. They form and they're around for several years, and they eventually publish a report giving their account of the attacks, and then the commission disbands. Another really famous one is the Watergate Commission, formed to investigate the Watergate scandal, and after that concludes and their investigation, the report is published, it disbands. So these aren't areas that are permanent enough to warrant a standing committee, but important enough that Congress wants to investigate them, so they can form a select committee to do that. And finally, a joint committee is another type of committee that draws members from both chambers. So most committees that we're talking about so far, they are confined to either the House or the Senate. Oftentimes, it'll be necessary though to involve members from both the Senate and the House. When there's coordination needed, for example, on a bill. The most common form of joint committee that we'll talk about in a second is a conference committee. These are formed at the end of a legislative process in order to reconcile two different versions of a bill. The House may pass a bill, and the Senate passes a separate bill that are similar in nature, but have some differences that have to be ironed out. A joint committee can be formed to do that. And finally, subcommittees they exist in all these different types of committees we've talked about, and these are just even smaller units within a committee to deal with even more specialized policy areas. So within agriculture, maybe there's a specific committee there talking about like irrigation policy, maybe policy with regard to different regions, stuff like this. When it's necessary, these subcommittees can be formed within the broader committees. All right, moving beyond committees, the parties also provide some degree of organizational structure within Congress. So the important factor as it pertains to parties is that at the beginning of each term, either Democrats have a majority in Congress or the Republicans have a majority in Congress. As it's happened for the last few terms, the Republicans have had a majority in the House. The last term they had a majority in the Senate, and they'll have one going forward to the next term in Congress. This is important because, one, the party in charge gets to determine leadership in the committee, so each of the standing committees have a chair, which will be occupied by a Republican going forward in this next term in both houses. They also get to appoint the most powerful people in either the House or the Senate. In the House, the head person there is the Speaker of the House, currently John Ryan, and it looks like he's going to be reelected to another term as Speaker. He has a lot of administrative power to determine what gets sent to the floor for a vote, what do bills eventually look like, what are the committee assignments. So this person has a lot of clout in both the procedures and the structure of Congress. In the Senate, you have a similar position, the majority leader, who performs a lot of the same functions as the Speaker, but the Speaker is actually the only position that's outlined in the Constitution. So Article 1 specifically points to this position, the Speaker of the House. The majority leader in the Senate is formed later on, just within that chamber, to perform a lot of the same administrative functions. And finally, beyond the party structure and the committee structure, there are some standing agencies within Congress that are there to help people in the Senate and the House do their job. So they get, in addition to this, their own staff. In the Senate, each senator has a personal staff of about 40 people helping them out. A little bit less in the House. These would be staffers that are paid for, and their salaries are funded by the government. They do things like helping write bills when a person in Congress is trying to sponsor a bill, they can have a high degree of influence in the writing. They'll be interacting with the press. Each person in the Senate and the House will have usually a dedicated staffer there to put out news reports and answer questions that are coming from the press. You'll have people dedicated to doing casework, interacting with people back in the home district. So a lot of these tasks that are important, but maybe the senator or the representative doesn't have time to do his or herself, these are fulfilled by the personal staff. In terms of congressional staff, there are people within specific agencies that do similar functions, just in a broader sense for anyone who wants them in Congress. So, for instance, the Congressional Research Service, this is a group where if you're in Congress and you have a question pertaining to some legislation that's being considered, or about the general state of things in the country, you can submit them to the Congressional Research Service. They'll have their own experts look into it and try to get back to you with an expert opinion about whatever your question is. The GAO, this is a group in Congress specifically designed to help people in Congress with their oversight responsibilities on the executive branch. So Congress, one of their jobs is to keep an eye on the bureaucracy, the various departments and agencies in the executive branch, to see what's going on there, and specifically to make sure that money is being spent the way it's intended on. The GAO just goes and makes sure the spending accounts match what's being allocated, and they're being things are being spent on what they should be. And also the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. This is a group that whenever there's a new piece of legislation that's introducing a new program, new spending, the CBO analyzes it and tries to determine what its impact on the budget is going to be. So if it's a new spending bill, how much will it cost? If it's a new tax, will it increase revenue or decrease revenue? So this office has a large role in trying to get a sense of what the fiscal situation is going to be, given the policy options that are on the table. To this point, we've talked a lot in broad terms about how the primary role of Congress is to pass laws, make legislation. This next section will be talking about the specific process through which this occurs. And what we'll be going over is depicted in this chart here. This is tracing from the beginning of the process all the way down to the end and the various different options that are available to the president. So maybe at first glance, this chart seems a little bit daunting, and it is a complex process with a lot of different steps. However, once we get through it, we'll go through over all of them, and you'll probably have a better sense of what's going on at each individual rung. So hopefully when we look at this chart in a few minutes after we get done with this discussion, you'll have a lot better sense of what's going on at each different point. Alright, so the first step in this very long process of making making a bill and putting it into law is the introduction of a bill. So, usually, if you're a person in the Senate or the House, your staff will help you, if you have an idea for a new piece of legislation, help you write it. You'll maybe get some help from the various research agencies that are available, maybe consult some experts on your own, and use this to craft language to an initial bill to submit to your chamber in Congress. The people who write the bill and submit it, introduce it, they're known as the sponsors. A bill can have just a single sponsor or a number of co-sponsors. So if there's a set of people in the Senate or the House responsible for writing the initial draft of a bill, they'd all be known as co-sponsors of it. Usually, once a bill is introduced, it's referred to a relevant committee. So if you have a bill that's dealing with agricultural policy, it'll go to the Agricultural Committee in either the House or the Senate. The specific determination of where each bill goes, though, is technically decided on by the Speaker of the House in the House. In the Senate, it's done by someone known as the President pro tempore, which is the person in the majority party with the most seniority, or absent, whoever this person is, if they're not presiding over the chamber at a given time when a bill is introduced. The Vice President can have that authority as well. This is just one of the formal responsibilities of the Office of the Vice President. He technically presides over the Senate. Usually it's handled by this other person, though, the President pro tem. Alright, so next, following introduction, Like I said, the bill will go to a committee, and then a variety of things happen once a bill goes into a committee. So the committee is going to be a place where revisions are made. Usually they're going to hold hearings, try to bring in experts to talk about it. However, the first action is usually the broader committee submits the bill to a subcommittee. So when this happens, the subcommittees will be smaller groups within the committee, composed of people with maybe even more specialized policy expertise or interest in a particular area. And at this point, a process called markup begins, and this will just be the period of time when you're in either a committee or subcommittee, and the bill gets revised. People in the committee can add portions to the bill, they can remove portions to the bill, they can revise and rewrite certain sections if they think it's necessary. And when this happens, at the same time, the committee and subcommittee is typically bringing in experts to testify at hearings. These would be people maybe in the private sector, sometimes academics who have particular expertise in the policy domain, maybe employees of the executive branch department or agency that's responsible for the type of policy that's under consideration. Basically bringing in all the knowledge that they can get a handle of to make sure the bill is as good as it can get. And this process goes on in subcommittee. When it concludes, the bill goes back to the full committee. At this point, additional markup can occur if there are people that are on the committee but not on the subcommittee, and they decide that they want to make changes. They can be considered at this point. Eventually, though, the full committee votes on the bill, whatever marked up version of it emerges. They vote on it, and if they approve of it, the bill then goes to the House or the Senate floor for a full vote. In other words, a full chamber of the House or the Senate. All right. So at this point, though, there is divergence in how things work in the House and in the Senate. So basically, this revolves around, how does the vote proceed, on the full floor of the House or the full floor of the Senate. In particular, and just to recap where we're at this point here, the bill has been introduced, goes through the committee system, and is passed, and we're trying to determine now how we get here. In the House, you have a special committee that deals with bills coming out of other standing committees. This committee being called the Rules Committee. The task of the Rules Committee is just to determine how the floor vote will proceed for any given bill that's going onto the floor of the House for a vote. Specifically, it's got two main areas that it decides beyond just scheduling. So it has to decide how long the debate will last on a particular bill. So before it's voted on the full floor of the House, members, the leadership are given, on each side is given time to allocate to its members to say whether they're in favor of it or against it and why. So the duration of this process will be determined in the Rules Committee, and oftentimes, more importantly, the number and type of amendments that can be offered on the bill is decided in the Rules Committee. So just a note on terminology before we proceed. We've used the term amendment before in terms of constitutional amendments, meaning additional text added to the Constitution. This is a totally different thing that we're talking about now. Here we're just talking about changes, amendments being added to a particular bill as it proceeds through the House or the Senate. So just keep that straight and recognize that when I use the term amendment, you have to be aware of the context it's being used in. In this context, we're just saying a bill can change if amendments are added to it before it gets voted on. Getting back to the Rules Committee, they get to decide what type of amendments can be submitted and how many can be submitted before a bill is voted on the full floor of the House. So there are two separate types of rules that they can assign to any given vote. One being an open rule and the opposite being a closed rule. An open rule is one that allows for a wide variety of amendments. Open rules would mean that people have a lot of freedom in terms of the substance of the amendments and also the number of amendments that are considered. To the opposite end, a closed rule would be one in which the type and number of amendments is greatly restricted, few in number, and have to be relevant to whatever the policy is that's being considered by the legislation. And the key here, and why the Rules Committee is so important, is that the type of rule that's assigned to any given vote can be used strategically. If you're a supporter of a bill, usually you're going to want a closed rule. An open rule, it would entail that lots of changes can be made to the bill. Things could possibly be added on if if the amendment is approved that you don't like, and really go against the spirit of the bill. So this is one reason you might, if you're a supporter, not want an open rule. Another reason is that if detractors of the bill, in turn, can also use the amendments tactically. So if they don't want the bill approved, they can attach what's known as riders to it, amendments that are attached to the bill specifically to try to make it unappealing to other members so that they vote against it. If you're trying to get enough votes to defeat a bill, for example, and you want to cause some Democrats not to vote for it, you might attach an amendment that seeks to reduce funding for certain social programs. If you're trying to get the Republicans to vote against it, you might attach an amendment that increases taxes in some respect. Amendments can be used to change the substance of the bill, and also strategically to try to kill it by making it not as favorable as it might be without the amendments. So if you want it passed, you want a closed rule. On the other hand, for the reasons we just talked about, if you're an opponent of a bill, you'd like an open rule to give you as many chances to defeat it and use these tools strategically to your advantage. And so the Rules Committee, like every other committee, the majority party controls more of the seats in it, and they control the leadership within the committee, and so they have a high degree of power to affect how things are voted on and what the ultimate outcome is through the strategic use of the House rules. So note, though, that what we just discussed with the Rules Committee, that only applies to the House. The Senate actually has its own procedures in place that set the rules by default. So in terms of debate, which we just talked about, in the Senate, debate is unlimited by default. Any senator can go up and talk about the bill in question, or really whatever he or she wishes to talk about, for as long as they wish to. As far as amendments go, the Senate also has a standing default rule that allows for unlimited amendments, and amendments which don't even have to be relevant to the overall substance of a bill. And you can imagine, given this, the prevalence of strategic amendments and strategic debate is a lot more prevalent in the Senate than it is in the House, by reason that they have this default set of rules. This motion that we're going to talk about here in more detail in a second, called cloture, is one approach that, if you want to end the amendments in the debate, you can use, but it has a pretty high threshold. And getting back to debate, the fact that debate is unlimited in the Senate also introduces a parliamentary maneuver unique to the Senate called the filibuster, which is a term that maybe a lot of you have heard before if you pay attention to the news and what goes on in the Senate. So basically, if you're up there debating and you have an unlimited amount of time, for however long you're up there, the bill can't be voted on. So everyone has to finish up with what they have to say before a bill can go on for final passage. Thus, if you're someone who doesn't want to vote on the bill, you don't want it to pass, one tactic is to just extend the debate indefinitely and never allow it to go up for that vote. Usually this is a coalition of people that would be leading this type of effort. Sometimes there are instances where just one really concerned senator will do this. And there's really no way to get around it except for the cloture motion, which we just talked about. So this would be another maneuver in the Senate where, if it's successful, it has the effect of, first of all, suspending debate, which gets rid of any filibuster that's going on. Also, it suspends the addition of more amendments. So only amendments that were submitted before the cloture motion will be considered, and only those that are pertinent to the substance of the bill. The problem with cloture is that it has a relatively high threshold, like a lot of different maneuvers in the Senate. It requires more than just a 50% plus one majority, it requires 60 votes in the Senate. And as it happens, most of the time in the Senate in modern political history, there's no majority party with that many votes. There's a very short period of time back when President Obama had just taken office that the Democrats had a 60-vote lead in the Senate for, I think, about a month before a state held a special election, which the Republicans won to remove that majority. But usually this isn't a threshold that you're approaching, even if you're in the majority. So in order for cloture and filibusters to be successfully stopped, you're generally going to need some amount of bipartisanship to get to that 60 vote threshold. Another note on filibusters that's worth mentioning at this point, and we can talk about it in later lectures as well, is that as it formerly was, filibusters could be used on presidential appointments as well. It used to be the case that if there was a cabinet appointee that the minority party in the Senate didn't like, they had the option to stop them from obtaining office by filibustering them. This was a tool frequently employed by Republicans during the period when they were in the minority and Obama held the presidency and the Democrats held the majority in the Senate. They used filibusters pretty frequently to try to prevent his appointments from taking office. So the Democrats eventually did away, by altering the Senate rules, they did away with the filibuster for presidential appointees other than the Supreme Court. The filibuster still exists on just regular bills and acts of legislation. It's still the same as it was before. But for presidential appointees, it's no longer there. So I think I mentioned this earlier that one of the options that the Democrats might have had prior to them changing the rules of the Senate, if they wanted to stop certain Trump appointees from taking office, they would have had the filibuster. The Republicans have a majority in the Senate of only 52, so nowhere near the amount needed for cloture. But that avenue has been foreclosed just by virtue of the fact that they changed the rules several years ago when they were in the majority. So that's kind of coming back to bite them at this point. Okay, so to recap, here's where we are now. We've talked about introduction, referral to a committee, eventually proceeding to a floor vote, and once the Rules Committee decides on the rule, and if the bill gets to a vote to the Senate floor and they pass, there's typically an additional step before anything can be sent to the president. And the reason this is the case is that bills can only go to be signed by the president if an identical version of the bill is passed in both houses of Congress. So we talked about how during this markup process, the bill can change substantially in the Senate committees and in the House committees. It can change by amendments that are offered on the floor of the House or the Senate prior to final passage. So more often than not, you've got bills that have some degree of difference between them when they're ultimately passed through the House and the Senate. Okay, so in order to take these two separate bills and reconcile them together, what usually happens is a conference committee is formed. And this is a type of joint committee, one involving members from both the House and the Senate, which gets together with the express purpose of ironing out the differences between whatever bill it's formed around. So you have a conference committee formed usually for each specific bill that needs to be reconciled. You don't have just a standing one usually that deals with more than one piece of legislation. Sometimes this can be an easy process if it's like a piece of legislation with a high degree of bipartisanship or overall just doesn't have a lot of differences between the House and the Senate versions. Oftentimes it can be a big challenge, though, to get to a single agreed upon piece of legislation if the House and the Senate have vastly different ideas of what should be in the bill. So when they are able to come together and put together that one unified piece of legislation, it then has to go back to the Senate and the House to be voted on. So it doesn't immediately, once the conference report, which is the unified bill, once it comes out, it doesn't immediately go to the president. it has to go back to the House and the Senate, where they both have to approve the identical version of the bill. Then, at that point, it goes to the president. And so, in line with this, we'll conclude our discussion of the lawmaking process with what the president's actions are in these cases when he does receive a bill. So we'll talk about 3 specific choices that the president has. More often than not, we're just going to be talking about 2. The first being to sign the bill. This is what happens more often than not. Usually, Congress goes through the legislative process in crafting these bills with an eye toward making them something that has a chance of being approved by the president. So more often than not, the president's willing to consent to the bills and sign them into law. So when the president puts his signature on the unified bill that comes on his desk, it immediately becomes law. In rarer cases, when Congress puts out a bill that the president doesn't agree with, he has the option to veto it. So this is one of the checks that the president has on Congress. If for whatever reason they pass through a bill that he doesn't think is in line with the Constitution, or he doesn't like the policy substance, he can veto it. And more often than not, this will mean that the bill does not become law. It ceases at that point. There is, however, one option available to Congress if they have a really high degree of consensus within the 2 different chambers. They can re-vote on the legislation with an eye toward overriding the president's veto. However, you require a 2/3 threshold in both chambers of Congress, which it's really extraordinary when you have a piece of legislation and you're able to get that high of a vote in both chambers for an override. So this is the vetoes themselves are really rare. The veto override is yet rarer. And finally, the president also has the option to take no action at all when he gets a bill onto his desk. If he ignores it, what usually happens is after 10 days, the bill becomes law by default. If the president declines to either sign it or veto it, it generally becomes law, so it has the same effect as if he were to sign it. The one exception to this is if after that 10 days Congress has adjourned and they're no longer in session, the bill doesn't become law, which in effect is the same as a presidential veto. And when this happens, it's called a pocket veto. So it has the same effect as a veto, but the president doesn't officially have to sign his name onto the veto. It just happens sort of by default by virtue of Congress not being in session to receive the bill back after 10 days. Altogether, this is, again, a pretty rare occurrence, the pocket veto. Alright, so at this point, we've gone through this entire chart. Hopefully what's going on at each rung here as you proceed down the process is more clear. And so, if you're still kind of overwhelmed by what's going on, just take it step by step and look at the various sections we've talked about. And it's pretty easy to understand what's going on at each step if you just decompose it in that way. Alright, so what we just talked about in this chart, this is the typical pathway for legislation. One specific alternative pathway, though, involves when money needs to be spent. This is known as the appropriations process, and it's a 2-step process. So first of all, a bit of background. Obviously, most of the laws that are put in place by Congress require some degree of funding in order to be implemented. Sometimes, if it's just a change in existing policy that changes things slightly, maybe not, but in most cases, if it's a new program, you're going to require some funding for it. Article 1 of the Constitution, though, says that the only way that money can be drawn from the Treasury is through an appropriations bill. So this is a special type of legislation that Congress has to go through and pass each year to make sure everything's funded. And like I said, it proceeds in 2 steps. First being authorization. So before the actual money is taken out and spent and a bill is designed with that purpose, the programs that are going to have money spent on them in agencies and whatever else is receiving money have to be authorized. So this is going to be basically just a set of guidelines and recommendations that says, here's what we need to spend money on, and here's how much we think should be spent. So at this point, again, this is just the first step in the process, and no actual money is being withdrawn from the Treasury at this point. In order for that to happen, we have to go through an appropriations process to produce a series of appropriations bills. Some of the most powerful committees in Congress, in fact, are the appropriations committees within the House and the Senate. These would be the committees that are ultimately responsible for crafting these appropriation bills that then go on to be voted on in the full House and full Senate. And so if you're on this committee, you have a large degree of influence over the spending of money. People on these committees obviously benefit because if they're self-interested, they can get more money to programs that they like, maybe more money in their district or home state. So this is a really coveted position, a really coveted committee whenever there's a seat open to get on. In terms of normal appropriations, I'm going to use that term here at a few different points. Regular appropriations, meaning this is the prescribed process by which money is allocated and spent. We'll get into what happens when this process isn't fully adhered to, which actually is more often than not. But in terms of regular appropriations, the first step is a congressional budget resolution, which is really a broad outline of what Congress thinks needs to be spent across the entire federal government within a given fiscal year. The fiscal year in the United States runs from October the 1st through September the 30th, so when we're talking about appropriations, they need to be completed by October the 1st in order for the funding to continue in the government. If completed on time, the appropriations bill will say how much money is being spent on each account in the federal government and what, if any, provisions are applying to those accounts. However, in going back about the last 4 decades, this process is usually not completed on time. It's extremely rare. Only 4 out of the last approximately 40 fiscal years has the regular appropriations process been done and completed by October the 1st. So when this is the case, more often than not, when we're going up to October the 1st and there's no regular appropriations bill completed and in place yet, if nothing is done, the government will run out of money and certain portions of the federal government will have to start shutting down. This most recently occurred in 2013 when there was a holdup in the Senate about specific senators not wanting to fund Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And so, obviously the Democrats did want to fund it, and there was a big fight. They couldn't agree on a resolution by October the 1st. This was sort of an intentional shutdown of the government to make a policy point that we shouldn't allow funding for Obamacare. More recently, there was another fight back during 2015 when we were approaching fiscal 2016 over Planned Parenthood funding, and this was a conflict where the shutdown was narrowly averted. And how it's averted is through what's called a continuing resolution. Whenever we get up to September the 30th, we're approaching that deadline, and the Congress recognizes that there's not going to be any resolution as far as the full regular appropriations bill. They can pass what's known as a continuing resolution, which is basically a stopgap measure. These resolutions will fund the federal government at existing levels from the prior fiscal year for a certain short period of time to give them enough time to complete the regular bill. I think back in 2015 when they passed the continuing resolution, they funded for an additional 90 days to give them time to settle on what's going into the full bill. Sometimes you'll see continuing resolutions upon continuing resolutions if it's a particularly difficult appropriations bill to finish. But basically, as long as you keep passing these, the government remains funded. And the final type of appropriations bill that you'll want to be aware of are known as supplemental appropriations. So you can think of these as basically emergency measures that can be put into place to give additional funding to the federal government, whatever departments need it, in the event that some exigency occurs after the appropriations bill has already been passed. So once you pass that bill, that outlines all the spending for the fiscal year, but if something like an earthquake, a hurricane, a military conflict that we didn't foresee arises, and we need an additional several $billions or whatever to fund relief or a war effort, something like that, Supplemental appropriations can be passed through Congress, and these will allow for immediate dispersal of funds to wherever in government needs them. So these are often really necessary in between the appropriations bills during the fiscal year. Okay, so that is the end of the congressional lecture. I will see you next time to talk about the presidency.